The blade sliced through rawhide with a whisper. And Vesper Caldwell collapsed into the arms of a stranger whose hands shook worse than hers. Blood seeped through the torn fabric of her dress where the words Comanche Lover had been carved deep. Between her shoulder blades, each letter a testament to the town's fury. The man who'd cut her down tall, weathered, with eyes like winter storms, caught her weight without a word. His calloused fingers surprisingly gentle as they found the pulse at her throat. "Easy now," he murmured, voice rough from disuse. "They're gone." Vesper's vision swam, but she could smell wood smoke and leather on his buckskin coat, could feel the steady rhythm of his breathing against her cheek. Behind them, Perdition Creek still burned orange against the October sky, the settlement's righteous anger having consumed half the main street along with her reputation. She'd been left to die on the old hanging oak, a warning to any other white woman who might dare love outside the boundaries of civilization. "Who?" she began, then coughed, tasting copper. "Name's Flint Masterson," he said, shifting her weight to examine the wounds. His fingers traced the air above the carved letters, never quite touching. "Been watching from the ridge, took me too long to work up the nerve." The irony wasn't lost on her, saved by a man whose Cherokee grandmother had given him those high cheekbones and bronze skin, a man who understood the price of loving across enemy lines. She'd glimpsed him before, trading pelts at Murphy's store, always alone, always watching from the shadows like some guardian spirit of the frontier. "Katona," she whispered, using the Comanche name that had sealed her fate. "My husband, they killed him yesterday." Flint's jaw tightened. "I know. I buried him proper, up on the sacred hill where the eagles nest. Figured he deserved better than buzzard bait." Vesper closed her eyes, letting grief and gratitude war in her chest. Katona had been worth every scar they'd given her, worth the exile and shame. He'd taught her to read the stars, to find water in the desert, to see beauty in a world that most folks painted only in blood and hatred. Their love had been a rebellion, fierce and pure as prairie fire. "Can you ride?" Flint asked, glancing toward the burning town. "They'll be back come morning with hemp and torches." She tested her legs, found them steady enough despite the fire lancing across her back. "Where?" "North. Got a cabin up in the Diablos where even the Apache give me peace." He helped her to a paint horse that materialized from the shadows like something conjured. "Won't be comfortable, but you'll be breathing." As they mounted, Vesper looked back once at Perdition Creek, at the life she'd never be able to reclaim. The townspeople had carved their judgment into her flesh, but they'd also carved away every chain that bound her to their narrow world. She was free now, in the way that only the truly desperate could be. "Why?" she asked, as they rode toward the star-drunk horizon. "Why risk yourself for me?" Flint was quiet for so long, she thought he might not answer. Then, sometimes salvation comes from the most unlikely places. "My grandmother used to say that broken hearts recognize each other across any distance." The horse's hooves struck sparks from the stone trail, carrying them into a darkness that felt more like promise than threat. The cabin perched on a ledge like an eagle's nest, built from native stone and weathered pine that seemed to grow from the mountain itself. Flint had carried her the last mile when fever took hold, her body fighting the infection that turned her wounds into rivers of fire. For 3 days she drifted between waking and dreams, seeing Katona's face in the shadows, hearing his voice in the wind that howled through the peaks. When consciousness finally anchored her, she found herself on a bed of buffalo robes, her back bandaged with strips of soft doeskin. The cabin smelled of sage and wood smoke, of something healing that reminded her of her grandmother's remedies. Flint sat by the fire, grinding herbs with a stone pestle, his profile sharp against the dancing flames. "The fever broke just after midnight," he said, without looking up. "Figured you 4 dead twice over." Vesper tried to sit, gasped at the pull of healing skin. How long? Week and a half. Had to keep cutting away the bad flesh they carved deep. His hands never paused in their work. You talk in your sleep. About him. Heat flooded her cheeks, but she met his eyes when he finally looked her way. I loved him. They can carve it into my bones, but they can't change that. Didn't figure they could. Flint rose, bringing her a cup of bitter tea that smelled like pine and hope. Question is, what comes after love like that dies? She sipped the tea, let its warmth chase away the lingering chill of fever dreams. Through the single window, she could see snow-capped peaks that touched the sky. A world so far removed from Perdition Creek, it might have been another planet entirely. Here, the silence felt sacred rather than oppressive, broken only by the cry of hawks and the whisper of wind through stone. My real name isn't Vesper, she said suddenly. It's Onata Corn Maiden. Katona gave it to me when we married in the Comanche way. Said I brought life to empty places. Flint nodded, as if this made perfect sense. Names have power. The one your parents gave you belongs to the world that threw you away. This one belongs to you. Over the following days, as her strength returned, Onata learned the rhythms of Flint's solitary life. He trapped and hunted, traded with the Apache. Bands who respected his neutrality carved beautiful things from wood and bone that no one but the mountains would ever see. His grandmother had been Cherokee, his father a Scottish trapper who'd loved her until consumption took her breath away. Been alone 7 years, he told her one evening as they shared rabbit stew by the fire. Lost the taste for other people's company after she died. Figured I was done with loving anything that could leave. And now? Onata asked, noting how the firelight caught the silver threads in his dark hair. How his hands moved with unconscious grace as he whittled a piece of cedar. He looked up, met her eyes across the space between them. Now I'm wondering if maybe solitude was just another kind of prison. Outside, a wolf sang to the stars, its voice echoing off the canyon walls like a question posed to the night itself. Onata felt something shift in her chest, a warmth that had nothing to do with fever and everything to do with the way this mountain man looked at her not as a curiosity or a conquest, but as a fellow exile who understood the weight of choices that couldn't be undone. That night, she dreamed not of Katona's death, but of his blessing. His spirit telling her that love wasn't meant to be buried with the body, that hearts could hold more than one great truth without diminishing either. Winter arrived like a lover's whisper, soft and insistent, wrapping the cabin in white silence that muffled even the memory of civilization. Onata's scars had healed into raised letters that told their story across her back, a map of hatred that she'd learned to wear like armor. Flint never asked to see them, never let his gaze linger when she changed the dressings. But she caught him sometimes tracing words in the frost on the windows. His expression distant and thoughtful. The mountain routine suited her in ways she hadn't expected. She learned to read weather in the way clouds gathered around the peaks, to set snares for rabbits and tan their hides with techniques Flint's grandmother had perfected. Her hands, once soft from a merchant's daughter's life, grew strong and sure, capable of split firewood and gutfish without flinching. The woman who'd been tied to that tree felt like a stranger now, someone she'd known in another lifetime. "You're changing," Flint observed one December morning as they worked side by side, priming jerky for the deep winter months ahead. "Getting your color back." Onata looked down at her hands, brown from sun and wind, calloused from honest work. Katona used to say that grief was like a poison that had to be sweated out. I think maybe he was right. They worked in comfortable silence, the kind that only came between people who'd learned each other's rhythms. Flint moved like he thought, deliberate and sure, never wasting motion or words. She found herself watching him more often lately, noting the way morning light caught the planes of his face. How his rare smiles transformed him from forbidding stranger to something warmer, more approachable. The moment came on Christmas Eve, though neither of them marked the date. A blizzard had trapped them inside for 3 days, and the cabin felt smaller with each hour, charged with an electricity that had nothing to do with the storm. They'd been reading, he from a volume of Shakespeare, she from a book of Cherokee stories his grandmother had dictated to a missionary. When their eyes met across the fire, "Onata," he said, and her name in his voice sounded like a prayer. She set aside the book, rose from her chair with deliberate slowness. "I know what you're thinking, that it's too soon, that I'm still mourning. Aren't you every day?" She moved closer, saw him tense like a deer scenting danger. "But mourning doesn't mean my heart stopped beating. Katona wouldn't want me to bury myself with him." Flint's hands clenched on the arms of his chair. "I won't be second choice to a ghost, Onata. Won't pretend that what I feel for you is anything less than complete." She knelt beside his chair, placed her palm against his cheek. "You're not second anything. You're the man who cut me down when everyone else left me to die. You're the one who saw me as worth saving when I couldn't see it myself." When he kissed her, it was with 7 years of loneliness behind it, gentle and desperate in equal measure. She tasted wood smoke and winter on his lips, felt the tremor in his hands as they framed her face. This wasn't the wild, consuming passion she'd shared with Katonia, was something deeper, built on understanding and choice rather than pure attraction. "The scars," she whispered against his mouth. "Tell me their story," he said. "All of it. Let me know what I'm claiming." So she did, there by the fire, while snow painted the windows white. She told him about the trial that wasn't a trial, about the preacher who'd called her a whore and a race traitor, about the moment when they'd carved the first letter and she'd finally understood that some kinds of love were considered unforgivable sins. She told him about Katona's execution, how they'd made her watch, how his eyes had found hers in those final moments and somehow managed to convey forgiveness for all the pain their love had brought. When she finished, Flint was quiet for a long time, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw. "You loved him knowing what it would cost." "Yes, and you're willing to love again, knowing what it might cost." She thought of the town burning behind them, of the life she'd left in ashes, of all the ways the world might still try to punish her for refusing to apologize for her heart. "With you?" "Yes." This time when he kissed her, there was promise in it, and something that felt remarkably like home. The thaw came early that year, mountain streams singing with snowmelt that carried winter's grip down toward the valleys. Onata woke to the sound of water running free and knew, with the certainty of someone who'd learned to read the land's moods, that their isolation was ending. Soon the passes would clear, traders would return to the high country, and decisions would have to be made about what came next. She found Flint on the cabin's narrow porch, coffee steaming in his hands as he watched the sunrise paint the peaks in shades of rose and gold. For months of shared solitude had changed them both, him less guarded, her less haunted. They'd built something fragile and precious in the mountain. Silence, but spring brought whispers of the wider world, of choices that couldn't be avoided forever. "Jericho McKinnon will be through in a week or 2, Flint said, without preamble. "He's a trader, runs goods between Denver and the Apache territories. Owes me a favor from way back." Onata settled beside him, accepted the cup he offered. The coffee was strong and bitter, flavored with chicory and something that might have been hope. "You're thinking of leaving. I'm thinking we can't stay here forever. Winter's one thing, but come summer, there'll be survey crews and mining prospectors crawling all over these mountains. Won't be safe for either of us much longer." She studied his profile, noted the tension in his shoulders that hadn't been there since Christmas. "Where would we go?" "Oregon Territory, maybe. Or California, heard they're more accepting of mixed marriages out there." Jericho could get us passage on a wagon train, help us start fresh where nobody knows our stories. The idea should have excited her a chance at the normal life that Perdition Creek had stolen. Instead, she felt only a hollow ache, the same emptiness that had consumed her in those first days after Katona's death. Running again. Sometimes running is the only way to stay alive. Onata set down her cup, turned to face him fully. Is that what you want? To spend our whole lives looking over our shoulders, pretending to be people we're not? Flint's jaw tightened. What choice do we have? You know what the world thinks of women like you, men like me. We can hide here until the mountain falls down. But eventually we'll be dead anyway. She stood, paced to the porch rail, where icicles hung like crystal tears. Katona and I talked about this once, about running to Mexico or Canada, some place where we could just be ourselves. You know what he said? Flint waited, watching her with those storm-colored eyes. He said home isn't a place you run to, it's something you build where you stand. That real love doesn't ask you to be smaller or quieter or more acceptable. It asks you to be exactly who you are. Consequences be damned. Pretty words, Flint said quietly, but Katona's dead because of those consequences. The truth of it hit her like a physical blow, but she didn't flinch. Yes, and I'm alive because of them. Alive and in love with a man who sees me as worth saving, worth choosing, worth the risk. She moved to him then, cupped his face in her hands, the way she had that first night by the fire. I won't ask you to die for me, Flint Masterson, but I won't ask you to live small either. If we're going to build something together, let's build it honestly. His hands came up to cover hers, rough palms warm against her fingers. What are you suggesting? That we stay? That we claim this place as ours and defend it if we have to? That we show the world what love looks like when it refuses to apologize for itself? The Apache respects strength. The miners and settlers. We'll be the real problem, but we'll handle them when they come. Flint was quiet for a long moment, weighing her words against 7 years of careful solitude. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of a decision that would reshape both their lives. My grandmother used to say that the mountain chooses its guardians, not the other way around. Maybe it chose us. Maybe it did. That afternoon, they walked the boundaries of what they decided to call home, marking trees and memorizing landmarks like newlyweds learning each other's bodies. The land stretched before them, wild and unforgiving and beautiful. A place where love could grow as fierce and untamed as the hawks that circled overhead. The ceremony took place at dawn on the summer solstice, witnessed by eagles and blessed by wind that carried the scent of wild roses. Onata had woven flowers into her dark hair and worn a dress of soft buckskin that Flint had crafted with his own hands. Each bead and quill placed with the devotion of a man who understood that some things were too sacred for haste. He stood waiting for her in the meadow where they'd first kissed. Dressed in traditional Cherokee regalia that had belonged to his grandmother, his face painted with symbols that spoke of protection and eternal bonds no preacher would have married. Them, no judge would have signed their papers, but the mountain itself seemed to lean in close as they spoke words in 3 languages: English for the future they'd build, Cherokee for his ancestors' blessing, and Comanche for the love that had taught her the true meaning of courage. Onata felt Katona's presence like a warm hand on her shoulder. Not jealous or possessive, but proud of the woman she'd become in his absence. With this ring of braided sweetgrass, Flint said, slipping the circle onto her finger, I bind myself to you until the mountains fall and the rivers run backward. With this necklace of bear claws and silver, she replied, fastening the heavy ornament around his neck, I choose you as my partner in all things, my shelter from all storms. They cut their palms with Katona's hunting knife, the blade Flint had retrieved from the Comanche burial ground, Dan pressed the wounds together, letting their blood mingle and drip onto the earth that would be their witness. The ritual was older than churches, deeper than law, binding them in ways that no government could dissolve. When they kissed to seal their union, the mountain seemed to sigh its approval, and Onata felt the last of her grief transform into something else, not forgetting, but acceptance. Love, she realized, wasn't a finite resource that diminished when shared. It was a fire that grew brighter when kindled by multiple flames. That night, they made love for the first time as husband and wife, their bodies moving with the rhythm of seasons, slow and deep and reverent. Flint traced the scars on her back, with his tongue transforming the carved hatred into something beautiful, reclaiming her flesh in the name of desire instead of punishment. She learned the taste of his tears when he whispered her name like a prayer, understood that healing was something they'd do together, one touch at a time. Summer deepened around them like a promise kept. They planted a garden in the meadow, coaxing tomatoes and corn and squash from soil that had never known a plow. Onata learned to shoot Flint's old Sharps rifle, picking off tin cans at 200 yards until her husband stopped looking surprised and started looking proud. He taught her to track deer through the forest, to read the stories written in broken twigs and disturbed earth. The first test of their resolve came in August, when a prospecting party stumbled onto their property, following rumors of gold in the high country. 5 men with more greed than sense, led by a bearded giant who introduced himself as Cyrus Bone and spoke to Onata like she was property to be evaluated and priced. "That's a fine-looking squaw you got there, Breed," Bone said, spitting tobacco juice dangerously close to Flint's boots. "Might be willing to trade for her, depending on how she performs." Flint's hand moved to the tomahawk at his belt with deadly gum. "You'll apologize to my wife, or you'll leave. Those are your choices." Bone laughed, a sound like rocks grinding together. "Wife? Hell, boy, that ain't legal nowhere in Christendom. You're just keeping a pet that can warm your bed." The fight was brief and brutal. Flint moved like his ancestors had when the Cherokee were still free, using the tomahawk with surgical precision while Onata covered him with the rifle, ready to put a bullet through anyone who tried to interfere. When it was over, Bone lay unconscious in the dirt, his nose spread across his face like jam, while his companions helped him stagger away with promises to return with the territorial marshal. "Let them come," Onata said that evening as they cleaned Flint's knuckles and planned their defense. "We've got the high ground and winter coming. Most importantly, we've got each other." Flint pulled her close, breathed in the scent of her hair that still carried traces of mountain flowers. "No regrets, only that we didn't meet sooner." As autumn painted the aspens gold and red, they prepared for war, gathering supplies and ammunition, learning to move through their territory like ghosts. The mountain had chosen them as its guardians, but being chosen meant accepting the responsibility that came with love, the willingness to fight for what mattered, no matter the cost. The territorial marshal arrived with the first snow, bringing 8 deputized men and a warrant that charged Flint with assault and Onata with adultery, vagrancy, and corrupting public morals through unlawful cohabitation with a person of mixed race. Marshal Tobias Kane was a thin man with pale eyes and the kind of mustache that suggested he took himself very seriously. He made camp at the base of the mountain and sent word that they had until sunrise to surrender themselves for transport to Denver, where they would face trial and proper Christian justice. Onata read the warrant by firelight, noting how it reduced their love to a list of legal violations, their marriage to a crime against nature. "They make it sound like we're diseased." "Maybe we are," Flint said, cleaning his rifle with the methodical care of a man preparing for battle. "Maybe love like ours is a sickness that spreads, makes people question why they accept the boundaries others draw for them." From their vantage point on the ridge, they could see the marshal's campfires twinkling like fallen stars. 9 men, well-armed, and presumably experienced. Sent to bring in two people whose only crime was refusing to apologize for their hearts. The irony would have been amusing if the stakes weren't measured in hemp rope and unmarked graves. "We could still run," Flint offered, though his tone suggested he already knew her answer. "Jericho's got connections among the Ute bands. They'd hide us until spring. And then what? Keep running until we're too old to remember why we started." Onoda checked the loads in her pistol, a Colt Navy that Flint had taught her to use with deadly accuracy. "I'm done being afraid of men who mistake cruelty for righteousness." The attack came at dawn, as they'd expected. Kane's strategy was simple: surround the cabin, demand surrender, and overwhelm them with superior numbers if they refused. What he hadn't counted on was fighting an enemy who knew every rock and tree, every deer path and hidden cave in a 5-mile radius. Flint and Onoda had spent weeks preparing the mountain itself as their weapon, setting deadfalls and snares, creating firing positions that offered perfect cover while leaving attackers exposed on the narrow trails. The first deputy died when his horse stepped through a camouflaged pit lined with sharpened stakes. The second fell to Onoda's rifle as he tried to climb the ridge behind the cabin, her bullet taking him clean through the heart at 300 yards. By noon, Kane had lost 4 men and gained nothing but the knowledge that his quarry would fight like cornered wolves. "This is madness," he shouted from behind a boulder, his voice cracking with frustration. "You're both wanted by the law. Surrender now, and I promise you'll get fair trials." "Fair like Katona got," Onoda called back, working the lever of her rifle. "Fair like every Indian who trusted white man's justice." A bullet whined off the rock near her head, stone chips drawing blood from her cheek. These men had come to take her to a place where she'd be judged by people who'd already decided her. Guilt, where her love would be dissected like something obscene and unnatural. The thought filled her with a cold fury that had nothing to do with fear. The siege lasted 3 days. Kane's men took turns trying to work their way up the mountain, but every approach ended in death or retreat. Flint moved through the peaks, like smoke, appearing long enough to fire a shot before vanishing again. His Cherokee blood singing with the joy of protecting what mattered. Onoda held the cabin, picking off anyone foolish enough to show themselves, her aim growing steadier with each kill. On the 3rd night, as the survivors huddled around their dying fire, Kane played his final card. "I know about your first husband, Mrs. Caldwell," he shouted into the darkness. "Know how he died screaming, begging for mercy that never came. You want to end up the same way? Keep fighting, and I'll make sure your half-breed lover dies just as slow." The words hit their target, but not in the way Kane intended. Instead of breaking her will, they reminded Onoda exactly why surrender was impossible. She thought of Katona's courage in those final moments, how he'd refused to give his killers the satisfaction of seeing him afraid. He died for loving her, and she'd be damned if she dishonored that sacrifice now. "Marshal Kane," she called, stepping onto the cabin's porch where the firelight could find her. "You want to end this? Come up here alone. Just you and me, face to face. Winner takes all." The silence stretched like a held breath, broken only by the whisper of wind through pine needles. When Kane finally answered, his voice carried the weight of a man who'd just seen his own grave. "You're on, you red-loving bitch. Dawn in the meadow, and may God have mercy on your soul." But as Onoda cleaned her weapons and prepared for what might be her final sunrise, she knew that mercy was a luxury reserved for people who lived within the boundaries of acceptable love. For the rest of them, there was only the choice between dying free and living in chains. Dawn came like a blade across the mountain peaks, sharp and cold and unforgiving. Marshal Kane stood in the meadow where Onoda and Flint had spoken there. Vows 6 months earlier, his Remington revolver gleaming in the early light. He'd chosen the place deliberately. She realized petty cruelty, designed to corrupt their most sacred memories with the stench of gunpowder and blood. Onata walked to meet him with the measured pace of a woman who'd already died once and discovered that survival was just another form of courage. Her Colt felt balanced in her hand, familiar as a lover's touch after months of practice. Behind her, Flint waited at the cabin's edge, his rifle trained on Kane's remaining deputies with the promise of swift vengeance if they interfered. "Last chance," Kane said, his voice steady despite the tremor in his gun hand. "Come with me peaceful, and I'll make sure your trial is fair. Keep fighting, and I'll hunt you both until the mountains fall." "You know what your problem is, Marshal?" Onata replied, stopping 20 paces away. "You think love is something that can be legislated, that you can make people pure by punishing what you don't understand." Kane's pale eyes narrowed. "The law is the law. God's law, man's law both say you're an abomination. Then maybe your laws need changing." The draw was simultaneous, 2 hands reaching for death with the speed of desperation. But Onata had been preparing for this moment since the day they'd carved their hatred into her back. Had learned to shoot with the cold precision of someone who understood that mercy was a luxury she couldn't afford. Her bullet took Kane's center mass, spinning him sideways into the dirt while his shot went wide, clipping a pine branch that fell like benediction across his still form. The remaining deputies, faced with their leader's death and the barrel of Flint's rifle, chose discretion over valor. They gathered Kane's body and retreated down the mountain, carrying with them the news that some kinds of love were defended with bullets and blessed with blood. In the silence that followed, Onata knelt beside the spot where Kane had fallen, her fingers finding the imprint his body had left in the earth. No satisfaction came with victory, only the hollow ache of necessity fulfilled. She'd killed to protect her right to love, transformed herself into something her grandmother would have recognized, but might not have approved of. Flint's arms came around her from behind, solid and warm and alive. "It's over," he whispered against her hair. "No," she said, leaning back against his chest. "It's just beginning. There'll be others, marshals and bounty hunters and righteous men with righteous causes. This mountain is ours now, but keeping it will mean fighting for it again and again." That afternoon, they buried Kane in the same meadow where he died, marking his grave with a simple stone cross that bore no name or epitaph. The gesture was practical rather than compassionate, leaving bodies to rot brought scavengers and stake stays. And questions, and they'd already answered enough questions with gunfire. As winter deepened around them, they prepared for the siege that would come with spring. Federal marshals would replace territorial ones. Bounty hunters would follow rumors of reward money. And somewhere in the halls of power, men in clean suits would decide that two people's refusal to apologize for love constituted a threat to the natural order. But the mountain had chosen them as its guardians, and they'd accepted the responsibility that came with that honor. Their cabin became a fortress. Their love, a flag planted in soil, watered with the blood of those who'd tried to uproot it. They were outlaws now in the truest sense, outside the protection of law, but also beyond its reach. Answerable only to the wild justice of the high country. On Christmas Eve, exactly 1 year after their first kiss, Onata felt the flutter of new life in her belly and knew that their war was about to gain another combatant. She placed Flint's hand over her stomach, watched his storm-colored eyes widen with wonder and terror in equal measure. "A child," she said simply. "Our child. What do you think?" Flint's throat worked silently for a moment before he found his voice. "I think the mountain just got another guardian." Outside, snow fell like blessing over peaks that had witnessed the birth of something unprecedented, a love so fierce it had declared war on the world rather than accept limitation. So pure, it had transformed hatred into hope. The future stretched before them. uncertain and dangerous and absolutely worth fighting for. 3 years passed like seasons in a dream, marked by the rhythm of storms and the slow accumulation of small victories. Onata's son grew strong in the mountain air, his dark eyes reflecting both his Cherokee grandfather's wisdom and his Comanche stepfather's courage. They named him Ayana, Eternal Blossom, and taught him to speak 3 languages before he could properly walk. Understanding that survival in their world required the ability to translate between different kinds of truth. The bounty hunters came in waves, drawn by rewards that grew larger with each failed attempt. Some died in avalanches triggered by carefully placed charges. Others simply disappeared into the wilderness, their bones picked clean by mountain scavengers. Word spread through the territories of a phantom couple who could kill at impossible distances. Who knew the high country-like spirits born from stone and wind? The legends grew with each telling, some claiming they were ghosts seeking vengeance, others insisting they were demons escaped from hell itself. Flint aged gracefully into his role as patriarch of their unlikely tribe, his hair going silver. While his aim remained true, he built additions to the cabin as their family grew, carved toys and furniture with the same careful devotion he'd once reserved for weapons. Watching him teach Ayana to track elk through fresh snow, Onata sometimes forgot that the rest of the world considered their love a crime, punishable by death. The second child came in the spring of their 4th. You're a daughter with Onata's fierce spirit and Flint's steady hands. They named her Sequoia after the Cherokee silversmith who'd given his people a written language, and the great trees that stood unchanged while empires rose and fell around them. She learned to shoot before she could tie her shoes, understanding instinctively that their paradise was built on the edge of a blade. Federal attention waxed and waned like phases of the moon, sometimes forgotten in favor of Indian wars and mining disputes, sometimes blazing with renewed intensity when ambitious. Prosecutors needed high-profile cases to build their reputations. A young attorney named Roosevelt wrote passionate editorials about the cancer of miscegenation that threatened to corrupt America's racial purity. Using the Mountain Guardians as the newspapers had dubbed them as his prime example of degeneracy. Run wild, but the mountain protected its own, and their children grew up understanding that love was something worth killing for, worth dying for, worth living for, despite all the forces arrayed against it. They learned Apache tracking techniques from visiting warriors, Cherokee plant lore from Flint's extensive knowledge, Comanche riding skills from horses that seemed to understand they carried the future of something precious and rare. The outside world changed around them in ways both subtle and profound. The Transcontinental Railroad connected east to west, bringing prosperity and pollution in equal measure. Cities grew like mushrooms after rain, swallowing prairies and forests with an appetite that seemed insatiable. But in the high country, time moved to older rhythms, measured in generations of hawks and the slow weathering of granite peaks on quiet evenings. When the children were asleep and the fire burned low in the grate, Onata would trace the scars on her back while Flint read aloud from books they'd acquired through careful trading. The carved letters had faded with time, but never disappeared, permanent reminders of the price they'd paid for refusing to accept other people's definitions of love. She wore them proudly now, battle scars that had transformed from symbols of shame into badges of honor. The turning point came in their 5th year, when President Grant signed legislation establishing Yellowstone as the nation's first national park. The precedent sent shockwaves through territorial governments. If the federal authority could protect wilderness from development, what other changes might be coming? Suddenly, their mountain sanctuary didn't seem quite so isolated, their rebellion not quite so impossible to sustain. A letter arrived that autumn. It's carried by Jericho McKinnon on his final trading run before winter closed the passes. The envelope bore official seals and the kind of heavy paper that suggested important men with important business. Onata opened it with hands that no longer trembled at the sight of government documents, her children watching with the alert curiosity of young predators scenting potential danger. "What is it?" Flint asked, noting the strange expression that crossed her face as she read. "A pardon," she said slowly. "Full presidential pardon for all crimes committed in defense of our ... How did they put it? Union blessed by natural law, if not by civil statute." She looked up, eyes bright with unshed tears. "It seems we have friends in Washington after all." The letter was signed by a circuit judge named Oliver Wendell Holmes, who'd apparently been following their story through newspaper accounts and legal briefs. His accompanying note explained that changing attitudes toward Reconstruction and racial equality had created an opportunity for more he called a symbolic gesture of federal compassion toward those caught between the letter of the law and the demands of conscience. But pardons, they quickly learned, were easier to grant than to enforce. The territorial authorities had invested too much pride in hunting them to simply forget years of humiliation and failure. Within weeks, new bounty hunters appeared on the mountain, these ones carrying federal warrants and the kind of military precision that suggested professional soldiers rather than opportunistic glory seekers. The final confrontation came on a bitter February morning when the snow lay 3 feet deep and the wind carried the promise of more storms. Captain Marcus Whitfield arrived with 20 cavalry troopers. Surrounding the cabin before dawn and calling for surrender through a brass speaking trumpet that made his voice echo off the canyon walls like the voice of divine judgment. "This is your last chance," Whitfield announced. "You're both pardoned, but only if you surrender peacefully and submit to relocation outside the territories. Continue resisting, and the pardon becomes void." Onata stood on her porch with Ayanna in her arms and Sequoia pressed against her legs. Her family arrayed behind her like pieces on a chessboard where the stakes were measured in heartbeats and breath. The irony was perfect freedom offered as long as they agreed to exile. Mercy contingent on accepting defeat. "What's your answer?" Whitfield called. She looked back at Flint, saw her own determination reflected in his storm-colored eyes. There. Children deserved to grow up somewhere, but not just anywhere. They deserved to inherit the world their parents had died to create, a place where love was its own law, where courage mattered more than convention. "Captain Whitfield," she called back, her voice carrying clearly across the frozen meadow. "Want our answer? Come spring, when the snow melts and the eagles return, look for our smoke on the wind. If you see it rising from this mountain, you'll know we're still here, still free, still fighting for the right to love as we choose. And if you don't see it," she paused, letting the implications settle like snowflakes on still water. "Well, I suppose you'll know that too." Spring came late that year, winter clinging to the peaks like a lover reluctant to let go. When the snow finally began to melt in earnest, Captain Whitfield returned as promised, bringing field glasses and the kind of grim patience that characterized men who'd learned to measure victory in small increments. He made camp in the valley and waited, watching for the smoke that would tell him whether his quarry had chosen exile or extinction. For 7 days, no smoke rose from the mountain. The cabin sat silent and still, its windows dark, its chimney cold as stone. Whitfield's men grew restless, muttering among themselves about ghosts and curses, about the foolishness of chasing shadows through country that seemed determined to swallow intruders whole. On the 8th day, the captain himself climbed to the meadow where so much blood had been spilled, leading a patrol that moved with the careful precision of men walking through a graveyard. They found the cabin empty but undamaged, furniture arranged as if the inhabitants had simply stepped outside for a moment and might return at any time. Children's toys lay scattered across the floor, carved animals and corn-husk dolls that spoke of lives lived fully despite the constant threat of death. In the center of the main room, a letter waited on the wooden table, sealed with wax that bore the imprint of a hawk's feather. Whitfield opened it with hands that shook slightly. Whether from cold or premonition, he couldn't say the paper was fine quality. The handwriting elegant despite being produced by someone who'd learned to shoot before she'd mastered penmanship. He read it aloud to his men, his voice carrying clearly in the mountain silence. Asterisk to Captain Whitfield and all who would hunt love in the name of law by the time you read this. We will be beyond your reach, not through death, but through transformation. The mountain that sheltered us has taught us its greatest secret, that those who truly belong to the wild can never be captured, only changed into something the civilized world cannot recognize or contain. Our children will grow up free, not because we ran from your justice, but because we discovered a justice older and truer than any written in your books. They will love as they choose, fight as they must, and pass on to their children the knowledge that some things are worth any sacrifice. Look for us in the flight of eagles, in the song of wind through stone, in every act of courage that chooses love over law. We are the mountain now, and the mountain remembers everything. With respect, but without surrender. Ta and Flint Masterson, guardians of the sacred peak. Asterisk. Whitfield folded the letter carefully, his trained eye already cataloging the details that might provide clues to their escape route. But even as he planned the search that would consume the next 6 months of his life, part of him understood the futility of hunting people who'd learned to become one with the landscape that sheltered them. The legends grew with each passing year, fed by glimpses of figures moving through distant passes, by Apache stories of spirit warriors who protected the sacred places from desecration. Miners reported tools that vanished from unguarded camps. Survey crews spoke of markers that moved in the night. And more than one railroad survey team returned with tales of phantom snipers who could kill at impossible ranges before disappearing like smoke on the wind. Some claim to have seen them: a tall man with silver hair and storm-colored eyes, a woman whose back bore scars that told stories of love and defiance, children who moved through the wilderness as naturally as deer. But the sightings were always at the edge of vision, glimpsed through shifting light that might have been playing tricks on eyes strained by altitude and isolation. The truth, as it often does, lay somewhere between legend and reality. The family had indeed vanished from their mountain stronghold, but not through death or magical transformation. Networks of sympathizers built over years of careful cultivation had spirited them away to new sanctuaries where different names and altered appearances allowed them to build different kinds of freedom. They became teachers and traders, healers and guides, carrying with them the knowledge that love was worth any price, any sacrifice, any fight. Ayanna grew up to become a lawyer, one of the first Native Americans to practice before the Supreme Court, arguing cases that slowly dismantled the legal barriers that had once made his parents love a crime. Sequoia became a photographer, documenting the vanishing frontier with images that captured both its beauty and its brutality, ensuring that future generations would understand what had been lost in the name of progress. And sometimes, when the moon was dark and the wind carried the scent of snow and freedom, smoke would rise from the old cabin on the sacred peak. Rangers would investigate, finding only cold ashes and the lingering sense that they'd missed something important by mere moments. The mountain kept its secrets, as mountains always do, protecting those who'd learned to become part of its eternal story. On a warm September evening, 30 years after that final confrontation, an elderly Apache medicine man led his grandson to a ridge overlooking the valley where Perdition Creek had once stood. The town was long gone, consumed by time and the railroad's hunger for efficiency. But the hanging oak still stood, its massive trunk scarred by lightning and seasons but unbowed. "Tell me again, grandfather," the boy said in the ancient language. "Tell me about the woman who refused to die." The old man smiled. his weathered hands tracing symbols in the dust that spoke of love and courage and the kind of victory that outlasts empires. She taught us that some chains can only be broken by those brave enough to forge new keys, he said. That love is not a crime to be punished, but a fire to be tended, passed from one generation to the next until the whole world burns with its light. As the stars emerged one by one in the darkening sky, grandfather and grandson sat in comfortable silence, listening to the wind carry stories across valleys and peaks and years. Somewhere in that vastness, the echo of old courage continued to resonate, reminding anyone willing to listen that some kinds of love are strong enough to rewrite the very laws that try to contain them. The mountain remembers everything, and what the mountain remembers becomes eternal.